It is my extreme honor today to share the podium with Ronnie Herndon, and Merced Flores, both of whom have spent their lives dedicated to a vision of top-rate educational opportunities for all children. Today, they'll focus on the status and quality of minority education in Oregon. Ronnie Herndon is currently president of the National Head Start Association and director of the Albina Head Start program in Portland. In his role as president, he provides leadership support to Head Start programs and staff across the nation, and this task, of course, involves advocating for low-income children and families. Through his vision and desire, all Head Start programs give quality services to children and families. The National Head Start Association partnered with Texas Tech University to develop the National Head Start Planning Academy for Head Start staff, and in 2 short years, over 500 Head Start staff have gone through the Academy programs. They've increased their knowledge and ability to better serve families in our rapidly changing world. Mr. Herndon was elected president of the National Head Start Association in April of 1995, but as we all know, he has been director and a huge community presence in Portland through Albina Head Start and other activities for over the last 20 years, since 1975. He also serves as executive director of the National Association of Schools in Excellence, a national organization of public school principals from urban and rural areas who are successfully educating low-income children. Ron is co-founder of several education, human rights, and political organizations in the Portland area, all of which have become part of the fabric of this community. Also a former teacher, counselor, and college instructor, and VISTA volunteer who has wonderfully maintained over the decades a high degree of energy, enthusiasm, and dedication. Merced Flores is Assistant State Superintendent at the Oregon Department of Education with responsibility for the Office of Compensatory Education. He brings to this position a background that began as a child of migrant farm workers. Merced grew up as the oldest boy in a family of 13 children, that is, and graduated from Clovis High School in Clovis, California. Assisted by a baseball scholarship, he attended George Fox College, where he received a bachelor's degree in psychology, sociology, and Spanish in 1973. He was awarded his master's degree in education from Linfield College in 1981. Mr. Flores' early career was as a classroom teacher, a counselor, and a high school and junior high school coach. His extensive association with migrant education programs began in 1973 as a tutor and a counselor. He then went to work as a curriculum specialist at the Oregon Migrant Education Service Center, where he eventually served as their director for over 11 years. In 1992, Merced was appointed director of Marion County ESD's bilingual multicultural education program in conjunction with his directorship of the Migrant Education Service Center. And in early 1994, Mr. Flores became Oregon's state coordinator of migrant education, and in June 1994 was appointed to his present position as assistant superintendent of our state system. In addition to various other honors, he's currently a member of Class 11 of the American Leadership Forum. Mr. Flores is committed to making it possible for all students to obtain an education that will help them succeed in life. He takes great comfort and pride in his Hispanic heritage and works extensively with migrant and Hispanic organizations throughout Oregon and the nation. And I am quite honored to be here today with these two individuals who have labored in these trenches over these many decades. I will turn the podium over now to Ronnie Herndon, who will be the first speaker.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to come before the City Club And I was talking to a friend of mine when I was trying to get my thoughts together for the presentation, and one of the things that we could agree upon is when talking about education, it's very similar to the story I'm sure that you've all heard about the blind men who were touching an elephant and asked to give a description of what they touched and what they thought it was, and the description came back in ways in which nobody ever would have figured out they had all touched an elephant. I feel it's the exact same way when we begin to talk about education. Depending upon which area you are touching, you come back with a description that if anybody objectively looked at what we were touching would never figure out we're all touching the same elephant. So what I'm going to try to do is just give you a little bit of what it feels like from how I touched the elephant today. Most of the statistics that we have, both locally, statewide, and nationally, continue to point out that there is a tremendous gap between the achievement level of minority children and white children. And the simplistic response to that is, oh, that must be because of the lingering vestiges of racism in this country. Very simplistic answer, but one that you will hear, or that we all know that low-income children can't do well in school. So somewhere in between the two, you'll get the common response. I think that both are in error, because if we look at the research a little bit more deeply, we will find, one, that low-income white children do poorly on those same achievement tests. Two, that there are several districts in which the majority of the teachers are black and Hispanic, the majority of the students are black and Hispanic, and they may even have a superintendent that's black or Hispanic, and those children are doing just as poorly as children in school districts where the majority of the teachers are white and the majority of the administrators are white. So it is a little too simplistic and inaccurate to say the reason these children don't do well is because of racism or because they come from families that don't expect them to do well in school. What reasons could there be? I think that we have been very, very reluctant in looking at this issue, not only the achievement or lack of achievement of minority children, but the poor achievement of American students when we look at international comparisons. We've looked at this from the view of what must be done for children to change and children to do better. We've been very, very reluctant to talk about the significant changes that must occur on the part of the adults in the system if we are going to see not only a diminishing in the gap between minority children and white children, but really diminishing the gap between low-income children and middle and upper-income children in this country. Starting with teacher preparation. If we look at the amount of time that a person spends in learning their craft as a teacher in college, there's absolutely no way that we would allow any other professional to have contact with us or our families who spent so little time in honing their skills. In this state, I think it ranges from maybe 2 months of actual work with children. Forget the theory, but actual work with children. Then once a person is certified, we let them loose in the classrooms that are very, very complex and far different than classrooms in years gone by, and we expect them to do great things. 2, the curriculum that's studied in most universities for teacher preparation has very, very little to do with the demands of the job market. Very, very little to do. So teachers are trained to be proficient in a curriculum that if you matched what they are learning in terms of reading, math, science, and then you walked out into the job market and say, are these the skills that are needed in your institution? No match at all. 3, on top of that, in Oregon today, and I think, I know the figures here, I think it stands around 60% of all high school teachers are teaching in a field that they did not major in college. So on top of having very little practical time working with children, having a curriculum that is mismatched in terms of the needs of society, then on top of all of those, you put people in fields where they had very, very little exposure. And I think in Portland today, we have bilingual education, which you have bilingual teachers that don't speak a second language. That's probably the worst example of what I'm talking about. And then we expect something magical to happen in the classroom. So that's just teacher preparation. And there's very, very little emphasis on doing anything about that, because see, then you get into tenure, academic freedom, and telling people you may be teaching something to these young students that is not needed by society, and then they begin to talk to you about contracts and tenure, and we can't do anything about it. We're very reluctant to change the roles of adults. Once these neophytes get into the classroom, and I'm talking about teachers, we find more of the same. Rarely, if ever, if we all recognize that preparation was poor, does anybody ever say, okay, preparation may have been poor, but this is what we want to do. If you're a reading teacher, we're going to get our best reading teachers that we have in the district and make sure that during in-service after school, you will be taught by them how to do it right. Doesn't happen. There's somebody who may be in an office of training or curriculum who themselves may have never been a good reading teacher or a good math teacher or a good science teacher, but they have the responsibility of doing in-service training. This would never occur in business. They're not a business that plans on being around. And I have suggested to friends of mine, I'm not aware of anybody who would get on a commercial airline in which the pilot received the same kind of instruction as we give teachers. Not anybody that's not beckoning for the men in white coats to show up. We allow this to happen with our children because I think, in spite of what we say, that we love children, they're so dear, in fact, our actions show something completely different. And when the tough decisions have to be made, we've given teachers poor training. They don't get the kind of in-service training that they need to help them to be proficient. And then when children don't do well in school, guess who gets blamed? It's the child and the family. That's the reason that certain children don't do well in school. And we hold children accountable for mastering information. And we are so serious about that, we say that if you don't do this right, you will get a poor test score. Starting very early. And I don't know about you, but I can remember when I got bad grades. It's humiliating both at school and also when I got home. We can give kids incompletes, D's, F's at a very young age. We hold them accountable. But we refuse to hold the adults accountable for the performance of the children. It's okay to say to a child, hey, you didn't cut the mustard. But a teacher can be in a classroom where they are supposed to be teaching reading, and 50-60% of the children in that classroom can do poorly, and nothing will ever happen to that teacher. As long as they don't do anything wrong, as long as they don't get caught committing a felony in front of Chris or somebody else in law enforcement, they will remain there. It has nothing to do with talent. A principal can be principal of a school in which the children for decades score beneath expectations. Nothing ever happens. As a matter of fact, unless it's changed, and Portland is not that different than most school districts, you will find in contract language phrases that say that principals and teachers will not be judged by the achievement level of their students. Completely different than the rest of the world in which we are all judged based upon how well our particular institution performs. So the adults in the system have made a pact. Whatever goes wrong, we are not going to be responsible for it. We will not be judged based upon, and we'll put it in contract form, we will not be judged based upon what happens. And to make it even a little bit tighter, we will also say, if the moment comes, as it has in Portland, when there will have to be layoffs, those layoffs will not be based on talent, but who's been able to sit in the seat the longest. So we can have people who have been here and who have never been able to get children to achieve at grade level or above. We can have another person who's doing fantastically well. But because we have by contract agreed that we make these decisions based on longevity, talent means absolutely nothing. And that's exactly the position we find ourselves in here. And again, what's occurred in Portland is not any different than what happens most other places in the country. So because of inadequate preparation, inadequate in-service training, contractual arrangements, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm jumping on unions, because see, the administrators are pretty slick. They have the same thing written into their contract, except they call themselves a professional organization. So the same thing that's talking about I will not be judged based upon the achievement level of students is in the same contract for administrators. No accountability on the part of staff, we end up where we are. So that's why I suggest to you the simplistic place to start is racism, low expectations, but it's far greater than that. How do we change this? I am convinced that change will not come from within the system. Like most systems, they do a very poor job of changing themselves. They have, I would also suggest, no incentive to change. Why? Anytime, and I don't want my friends in the county and the city to get too teed off with me, a system can do as poorly as most of these educational systems do. Portland, one example. And when I say poorly, I'm not talking about just low-income kids. If you look at the match between what children learn and what they're able to do in the job market, for most of these children, there is such a wide disparity, you could drive 3 Mack trucks through it. Anytime the county and the city turn over millions of dollars to the district when it's in trouble and have absolutely not one word of you shall use it to make these kinds of changes, then as a system, why should I change? No accountability at all. No one saying that if you do this, we expect the following things to occur, as you would in most business deals. We expect achievement levels to go up 10 points in classrooms, and that will depend upon whether you get the rest of the money. Nothing. Take the money and hopefully things will work out and they turn around and lay off the folks, regardless of talent, but just based on longevity. The system will not reform itself from within. The only hope comes from the public. And I have arrived at the point where I think that that will happen because of parents. The rest of us don't have the same interest in the system, though we may feel that it needs to change, but only when parents organize themselves and are able to put the kind of pressure upon the system to make it change. I don't think it will happen. There was a time a few years ago when the business community got involved in education, and I think they ran out of steam. And what some folks have said, I got tired of going to committee meetings. I got tired of being told I really don't understand. I got tired of hearing dogma that I don't know if Einstein could have understood, and yet they wanted my money. So the pressures for change in education to address the gap between achievement level of low-income children, minority children in general, I think it will have to come from organized parents who make it their mission to insist on these changes, or the system will be confronted in ways that might prove to be embarrassing. Now that might sound a little alarmist, but I'm suggesting to parents, if you're waiting for somebody else to step in and change it for you, it's not going to happen. So in conclusion, I would like to say this. Those of us who are sincere about doing something about the school system, I think we should work with parents very quickly. The problems are getting worse for all children, but most certainly for children from low-income communities. And the polarization that's beginning to take place, I think, is getting worse. And because of welfare reform and a number of other things that are happening in this country, the gap between the haves and have-nots is getting wider and will get worse. And the one system that all of us have always looked to give our children a chance so that they can be better, achieve more than their parents, has been the system of education. And if we don't insist that it work at international standards for all children, not just the few, then I think that those of us who tremble thinking about the amount of money that we are putting in jails and prisons have not begun to see the kind of hell that we will leave for our children and grandchildren. Thank you very, very much.
I think there are some provocative thoughts that Mr. Herndon has provided to us. I think that it's something that we should be considering at all times, since we do have a lot of minority populations in trouble at this point. I'd like to express my comments specifically to the Hispanic population. That is our fastest growing population in the in the state of Oregon. As all of us know, Hispanic population in the state of Oregon is growing tremendously. We are now in a school system that has been traditionally white and largely homogeneous. And so Oregon faces many different difficulties at this time. And there are several questions that I want you to think about as I make my presentation today. Will Oregon hold its Hispanic students, and also we can talk about minority students, to the same high academic standards as all students? Will it provide the educational services Hispanics need to achieve all these standards? And do we as Oregonians expect Hispanic students to become productive contributing members of society, or will we allow them to become the same individuals that they've been in the past and relegate them to the low-wage, dead-end jobs that we have at this present time? Let me talk a little bit about the population growth, especially for the minority populations. 3 of every 5 new minorities in the state of Oregon are Hispanic, and Hispanic students are the largest and fastest growing population in schools today. If you were to look back 10 years ago, we had 15,000 students in our schools. At the present time, there are over 40,000 Hispanic students in the state of Oregon. Oregon reflects a trend that tends to be across the country where the Hispanic population is growing more quickly than any other. You look at, many people think, well, it's mostly a Mexican population that's coming over to big towns like Portland, like Salem, but it is not. You are looking at other groups of people, other ethnic groups, such as people coming in from South and Central America, the Salvadorians, the Cubans, the Puerto Ricans. At the present time, though, if you look at the Hispanic population, over half of the Hispanic population is of migrant descent or of migrant. We have many families that come in from Mexico to pick our crops. Oregon, in fact, if many of you might not know this, but that Oregon is the second largest receiver of kids from the state of Mexico or from the country of Mexico. We are drawn by agricultural interests, and their families have hopes and dreams for all of them. They take on backbreaking work to take on many of the responsibilities in order for their children to achieve. Some remain migrant, but many of us have stayed in the area and have become caretakers. We have become caretakers of our area, caretakers of new facilities in this area. We've also become grocery store owners, and we have become restaurant owners, and we have become owners of different businesses. So you can see that, again, many of our migrant families, many of our Hispanic populations are staying in this area. But one thing that has been a big problem in our schools, and that is language. Language is often a barrier for many Hispanic students. Since 1988, the number of students in Oregon enrolled in English as a second language in bilingual classrooms has tripled from 7,000 to over 21,000. However, there are more students that need help than there are available programs. Federal funding has not kept pace with many of the concerns that we have. Federal appropriations were only 40% less in real dollars in 1990 than they were in 1980. Nationally, more than 25% of students with limited English proficiency do not receive special services. In fact, it's really hard to understand, but many times what happens is that schools do not even apply for those dollars that are available to them. We have not been able to apply even for the reimbursement dollars that are available at the state level, and this is becoming very discouraging. The farther behind these kids get, especially with language, is that they will become discouraged, they will become frustrated, and eventually drop out of school. We need to think about, as we make our comments about teachers, is that teachers are very special to all of us. All of us had somebody special to us. But I believe today that teachers must be trained to deal effectively with students from multicultural populations. Across the country, colleges are not producing teachers qualified to serve Hispanic students or any other population. There's where we're missing the boat. Bilingual educators are first to go when money gets tight. In recent dealings in Portland, we had some hires who were cut to protect the jobs of some of the most senior teachers. Today, there are more minority teachers there are more minority students and fewer minority teachers. Last year, minorities represented 14.7% of the state student body, but only 3.9% of teachers and school administrators. Compared that to 12 years ago, when minorities represented 9.4% of student enrollment, there were only 2.1% of teachers and administrators. The other thing, too, about teachers is teacher licensing rules do not require teachers to pursue education and train to better serve incoming students. Oregon is one of the few states in this country where the State Department of Education does not control the licensing and certification of teachers. Instead, the teacher licensing agency is controlled by an independent agency, which in turn is controlled by various other interests. Under the rules of this independent agency, after the first 5 years, teachers do not have to take another course or training workshop for the rest of their career. So think about that and consider this. As a result, Oregon teaching force is not qualified as it could be. More than 59%, as Mr. Herndon said, more than 59% of all secondary teachers in Oregon do not hold degrees in the subjects they teach. These statistics reflect the national picture. Poor minority students across the country generally have less qualified teachers. A national study found that 86% of science teachers in predominantly white schools were certified in their field compared to only 54% of predominantly minority schools. In fact, a report by the Education Trust found that all 50 states failed to provide Hispanic and African American children with adequate schooling. So 2 days of progress towards equal educational opportunity appears to have grounded all that to a halt. Now the gap is widening between the rich and the poor, the white and the minority. The achievement gap has widened since the 1980s. On the National Assessment of Educational Progress, average reading scores of white students have remained nearly the same since 1975. However, during the same time, average reading scores of Hispanic students took a nosedive on a scale of 0 to 300, shooting up to 275 from 252, but then dropping to 263. So you can see that Oregon test scores reflect the national picture. Hispanic students are falling significantly below the state average on reading and mathematics tests. And again, students who do not keep pace with their peers fall behind in school and are at greater risk of dropping out of school. As you know, Hispanics and their dropout rate is 16% this year. Last year was 17%. And as you can see, that is not something that all of us should be bragging about, a very, very poor performance within our own schools. Students that, again, that are not getting the basics, that are not receiving some of the work that we need in the classroom are actually falling out at a greater and faster pace. We think of the 16%, but actually we are looking at a much higher percentage. A study by the Achievement Council of California found that most white and Asian American students who score well on standardized tests are placed in more demanding classes. Meanwhile, only half of the Hispanic and black students who scored just as well were placed in higher level courses. The Education Trust also reported that Hispanic and other poor students who received top grades for their work would be considered substandard in predominantly white schools. There are different models that will give us an idea of what we can do to help students, but there are also ways to address the problem. Students perform at the level that they are expected to perform. If Hispanic students are to become productive, contributing citizens, they are to be held to the same academic standards as white students. They must be provided with qualified teachers and offered challenging instructional materials. There is a tremendous growth in Hispanic population, which means that Oregon has a growing number of families that are new to the educational system. Schools need to welcome these new members in their communities, include them in school activities, and encourage them to support their children in school. When parents value and support education, their children will perform in school. I was talking to a friend of mine in California, and he was talking to me about this program called La Familia, the family. And this is a program that encouraged the entire family to come to the school site, and every evening they would get together. The teachers would provide English as a second language courses or adult basic ed courses to the parents, and the kids would receive child care, and the older kids would receive instruction to accrue credits for graduation. These are the type of programs that we need to have across the state of Oregon. We need to have those programs that will embody the entire family. Another reoccurring subject that is always an issue at our schools, and it's becoming more and more. Most of us know that this is a country of immigrants. The public school system has enabled many immigrants to become contributing citizens. If newcomers are to be independent and not dependent, they must have access to public education. State Superintendent Norma Paulus wrote to all schools recently explaining that immigration status of students and their families is irrelevant to school admission. She also said that constitutional law is clear that school districts are prohibited from requiring students or their families to show proof of immigration or to not deny educational services to children. All children living in school districts are eligible to attend schools in that district. However, too often, uninformed people in front offices improperly turn away students, and this practice must stop. It happens over and over and over again. It seems like we have to ask and tell and inform people on a yearly basis because it happens all the time. The Presidential Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanic Americans stated that bilingualism, and that's another issue that we have to deal with, bilingual education, but it stated that bilingualism should be treated as a rich cultural and economic resource and not as a liability. Many times what tends to happen is that because somebody speaks a different language, they think it is a liability and we should not allow kids to speak a different language. We have had these conversations before in the 1950s, and still in 1997 we have these discussions that kids cannot speak another language in the classroom. Think about the times and think about your friends that were in the classroom that their mouths were taped shut because they spoke a different language. That continues today, and that needs to stop. Last year, the Board of Education set high academic standards for all students. Schools will be accountable for helping all students achieve those standards, and state test scores will help students pinpoint where improvement is needed. There are schools that are doing much of that. They are looking at what their test scores mean and how they can help other students. I wanted to mention one of the high-quality instructional programs that consider the needs of Hispanic students and how, if you have a good quality program, they can succeed. There's a little school outside of, Hood River called Pine Grove Elementary. It has a student population that is 74% Hispanic and largely migrant, about 50% migrant. The school is committed to providing an equal educational opportunity for all of its students, and to improve communications, many staff are studying Spanish. Students are encouraged to take English and Spanish reading activities to share with the family, and all the communication between the school and the home are bilingual. So you can see that there is an effort there by the school district to do something good for the family, and the entire family, not necessarily a student here and a student there. And you can see that this successful program was important. It did make a difference because when the actual kids came to school, they were less than proficient in their skills, but by the time they were fifth graders, they were at or above the state average on their state tests. And this same type of thing is happening here in Portland. We have Woodlawn Elementary, Kenton Elementary that are doing the very same type of thing. Down the street we have Barnes Elementary that has a high Hispanic population. They are exceeding the state average scores. So you can see that there are some changes that are taking place. We at the Department of Education are also doing some things to collaborate between Mexico and the United States. We are gathering some of our services with several states of Mexico, exchanging information about students. We are bringing teachers up during the summertime to ensure that they will have bilingual instruction and that they will have cultural diversity as part of the school curriculum. But we also are trying to look at kids that can make a difference for other kids in the community. We are bringing kids into a leadership conference over at Linfield College and talk about problem solving, self-esteem, career possibilities, and cultural appreciation. So we are doing some things. We are also teaming up with organizations like Nike to make sure that they will make a contribution and make an effort to go from school to work activities. Remember that eventually these kids are going to be part of your workforce. Oregon has a proud tradition of leading the nation with progressive solutions to public policy issues. Effectively educating a growing population of Hispanic children is a pressing policy issue. Here's an opportunity for Oregon, once again, to lead the nation in addressing this issue, but we cannot permit a double standard. We say high expectations for kids, but at the same time, we are not doing the same things for our teachers and administrators. We have to make sure that if we're going the same route, that we do the same thing for each other. I believe truly in continuing professional development for teachers, teacher assistants, and administrators alike. And I think if we do our job that way, I think that we will have a better workforce. Failure should not be an option anymore. And as one thing, when I think about things that take place in my life, and I think things are good, I always think to myself, as the old third baseman for the Oakland A's said, contentment stinks, stay focused. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you both for a fascinating discussion. Ron, I don't want to let you stop where you stopped. I was very moved by your challenge to parents. What I heard you say was that the action, the change needs to come from the parents. So what I'd like to know from you is what form should that action take?
I think that parents need much of the information that has been shared with Mr. Flores about expectations, but it has to go further than that. For parents to say, I want my child to read well, that's not enough, because reading, for the most part, as it's taught in this country, is reading taught at the most elementary level, which is reading for leisure. The kind of technical reading that children and young adults need to do well in today's workforce, they're not getting. The kind of applied sciences that children need if they're going to do well. Here in Oregon, we're in an embarrassing situation where you have to import in talent to work in the high-tech industry because our children don't have the skills to do the job. This is crazy. We're paying money for a system of education that is not even responding to our local workforce. So parents need to have the information, because if they don't, they can get faked out by somebody telling you the reading scores have gone up. Well, that's great. It's gone up in leisure reading. It has little to do with the requirements of the workforce. So one, a tremendous amount of education on the part of parents on what to ask for. Two, make sure that they hold the adults to the same standard of accountability that we hold children. And three, that whatever occurs, that the adults in the system will be judged based upon the performance of the children. And lastly, would bring in people from the workforce and where the emerging workforce is going to be, and say, what does a person need to get hired here? What do they need? And to make sure there's a direct match between those skills and the skills that children are supposed to learn, and certainly through high school. And that's the kind of information that parents need, and then to be very insistent and demanding that school systems meet this, and they meet it very quickly, because they don't have a lot of time to fool around with people giving excuses, committee meetings, and don't you understand?
You know, I could add to that. One of the things that happens many times is that for children who are bilingual, or who are monolingual, limited English proficient, those who speak only Spanish, and other individuals who are limited English proficient, or their first language is another language other than English. What tends to happen many times, as I see, is we tend to say, kids, you know, you've already learned your Spanish. Every so often where the kids are in the playground, they'll say, sí, yes, or throw me the ball. And so at that time, teachers are thinking, well, that child knows English. You know, he can speak. You know, he'll do all right in the classroom. But if a child does not have that basic understanding, the basic instruction, the basic skills in their native language, they're not going to be able to make that transition. So again, when we start looking at academic reading, academic content that the child has to learn, it's going to be a lot tougher for a child. And I think that we need to make sure that we're looking at good, strong bilingual ESL programs in order for kids to make it, because it is not, when we're talking about academics and the academics that we need once we get out of school, it makes a big difference on who gets the job and who does not get the job.
Hi, I'm Doug Capps. I'm a City Club member, and I'm also a candidate for the Portland School Board. And I mentioned that fact, Ronnie, because I wanted to ask you a question specifically about the school board, and that's your candid assessment of the extent to which you think the school board is sensitive to bridging that gap that you've so eloquently described today between the student performance between minority and white students. And I have a second question to ask, kind of related to that, I think, and that's the extent to which you think that the performance-based standards that the board is working to implement as part of the 21st Century Education Reform Act might address that issue of not only student performance, but teacher performance and teacher accountability.
I think that everybody will tell you that they're sensitive, but that's gotten to the point to me that doesn't mean a lot. If I'm hanging by a fingernail from the 5th floor of the building, I'm sure a lot of people could say that they're very sensitive to my predicament. But not everybody's going to try to help me get back up on the ledge, and that's the same way I think that children are today in the school system. Being sensitive and making the kind of tough decisions that demand accountability, that hasn't occurred. And every time that I hear people talk about raising standards, it's raising standards for kids. And I ask the question, who's going to retrain the teachers? The same university system that many of the professors haven't been in a classroom since the last time Gene Autry jumped off a champion? And they're the ones who are training teachers? I mean, come on, let's get for real. Who is going to retrain the teachers? Is it going to be the system of in-service that we have now where people teach others not based upon skills or proficiency, but I used to be the high school gym teacher, now I'm the principal, and now I'm in the curriculum department? So there's no match between achievement, as Merced said again. Right now, 60% of the high school teachers in Oregon are teaching in fields that they didn't even major in. Regardless of what I think about the instruction that they receive, they're not there. So yes, we can raise performance expectations for young people and kids, the least defenseless, and most of them don't vote. But we are very reluctant to put our foot down and say that there will be some common sense in teacher training and there will be accountability. And also, I'd like to acknowledge Randy Richardson, who I think is also a candidate for school board, who's here, local guy, made good, went through the school system, Morehouse, Syracuse Law School, and is back working for the DA system. So I think you might have a little competition here. So that's my short answer.
There's so much, and it's hard to limit myself to just one. I'm Leslie Hildula, City Club member. The leverage point for change. I had an acquaintance with the OEA just this week telling me that nobody cares more about teacher excellence than the OEA, and are very supportive of helping teachers move on who need to move on, as long as it's done in a fair and ethical way. And that principals have the power to make that happen, and that school boards have the power to ensure that principals make that happen. And we as citizens, right, we vote in our school board. So, I mean, where is this leverage point of change not happening?
At every point, because as citizens, most of us don't. That's why I keep going back to number one, where teachers get trained. Very rarely do you hear any professional organization want to challenge the university system of teacher preparation. It's almost, and I hate to say it's almost like the mafia, but everybody's got a little stake in this. When they say you have to go back and get additional training, guess where you go back to? There's a little money involved in that. The people who set the standards, there is a relationship between all of the adults involved, and it would appear to me that none of them want to rock the boat. So if they're concerned about the performance of teacher, I would have expected that a long time ago they would have said the emperor has no clothes. Teacher preparation does our members a disservice. They're not getting the skills that are needed by children in today's world. And based upon that, then I think that if we start there and then move all along the continuum, then we get to the point where school boards say the exact same thing. High expectations for the adults, and this is what we will do this is what we will do to make sure that happens. Most certainly, when the adults sign a contract with any professional organization that says that you will not be judged based upon the performance of the children, and if there have to be layoffs, we will do it based upon who sat here the longest. And I have to wonder, how concerned are they, both the people who asked for that as a professional organization and those who agreed to it representing us, the public. And that's exactly what has occurred almost every time there have been contract negotiations, at least in this city and most places around the country.
One of the things that I wanted to mention is that a while back we were trying to get an ESL bilingual licensure, and that was one of the roughest times that we had. We wanted to have some type of license that would ensure that we would have good quality teachers. And what happened is that we got all kinds of stuff from a number of different organizations, and they felt we should not have a special endorsement for these individuals. But what we were trying to do is to find some good quality teachers that would be able to go into the classroom and to be able to provide kids who had LEP or limited English proficient capabilities. And there were a lot of walls. But eventually we got that passed. We have an endorsement, and that will go into effect in 1999.
Dr. Joe Eusterman, a brand new member of the City Club, and I was told I could ask a question today. I thought your remarks were refreshingly politically incorrect, and I want to commend you both for that. In my own mind, I think the voters of Oregon probably would not have passed Measure 47 if they felt they were getting their money's worth out of the schools. My question is, the apprenticeship program in Germany seems to be working extremely well to help people cope with life's demands. And you alluded to it, Mr. Herndon, I believe, in saying you were getting people from the workplace to come and talk to the students, tell them what they need. But is there anything in the future for a more formal apprenticeship-style program here in Oregon?
I don't think so, though I understand that people are talking about certificate of initial mastery and certificate of advanced mastery that children are going to have, young folks are going to have when they graduate from school at some date. But the kind of system that they have in Germany and other European countries, I don't see anything that we're doing that comes close to that, again, because we don't want to impact the role of adults. Because once you do that, that means you have to have a teacher or an administrator that can teach that skill. If we've got a 60% mismatch on the old-fashioned curriculum that does not relate to today's world, guess what we have on the curriculum that the rest of the folks are studying around the world? Zero. So who do we go to retrain the teachers? The same people who are in these systems of higher education who, again, if I would ask just one thing, that if I am going to train a teacher, at some point in time, I can show that I was a great teacher, that children in my classes scored at or above national levels in reading and math, so that gives me the right to train new teachers. There's no requirement for that. There's no connection between all these different parts of the system. So to answer your question, no, I don't think it's going to happen because nobody wants to go back to the basics and demand that the adults change. All right to change expectations of kids, but nobody wants the adults to change and hold them accountable.
The standards are set. We do have the SIM and the CAM, and in fact, this year's 8th grade class will be taking the SIM or receive their SIM in reading and writing. The one thing is that needs to be considered is the CAM standards have already been set, Certificate of Advanced Mastery. But the other pieces, the partnerships, the pieces where we have for kids to make it from school to work, I think those pieces still are in the establishment development area.
Greg McPherson, City Club member. This is a question for Mr. Herndon, although I'd appreciate Mr. Flores commenting on it as well. I hear you call eloquently for accountability. One of the most significant aspects of any system of accountability is the compensation system. Would you favor changing the compensation system for teachers and administrators from one that is primarily seniority-based to one that is based on merit?
Yes.
You know, I'd comment on that there because there is a lot of discussion on that at my level. And so I'm very interested in how schools will get whole groups of kids to move from proficient levels to advanced proficient levels. I'd like to see, we have this thing that we're working with right now called adequate yearly progress, and like to see entire schools move from one level or to the other. So groups of kids are moving.
Matthias Kemeny, City Club member. I don't know how to phrase this comment into a question, so I'll just say it. First of all, Ron Herndon, this is probably one of the best speeches I've ever heard you give. and I'd like to compliment you. But, Mr. Flores, you gave a very nice speech also, except as an immigrant to the United States, maybe I have a bone to pick. And the bone is language. Language is a unifying factor in the United States. I also arrived in America without speaking English, but my parents and we as a family decided to speak English only at home in order to accommodate ourselves to this wonderful country. And I would suggest that any immigrant to America and their families make that as a goal. Make that as a personal goal, to learn English and master it with all their hearts in order to become part of the fabric of this country with all of its problems and all of its opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One of the concerns that we have many times are different movements and different legislation that takes place requiring or talking about English first or English only. And those type of things I believe concern me, because I believe that English is already the common language that we have here in the U.S. And we have, at the present time, if I can give you some information, we have list and list and list of individuals who want to take English courses. In fact, we have community colleges all over the state cannot meet the demand of those people that are coming from other countries and trying to learn English. I mean, we want to be successful in this country, and people are trying to learn English as fast as possible. In fact, when my first language was Spanish, and I came over, and I think I speak English okay. There's a few little words I still have a little trouble with, but I think I do okay. But we have individuals who learn English from others, and others that pick up just any type of related language. And I think that we're trying to do that. I think in our schools we're trying to do that, but at the same time it takes a little longer for those individuals who have come over from Mexico to make that transition over to the United States. And if we're talking about cognitive language that we need to in our classroom, it's much, much tougher for them. But if they have a good base in their primary language, they're able to make that transition, and I believe that we're going to have those individuals eventually. But I agree that we do need to make the transition over to English, but I agree with also with many other people that our culture and language are very important to keep.
This will have to be a very quick question.
Okay. My name's Eric Iverson. I'm a City Club member. I wanted to follow up on this topic that you've been talking about and focus on principals, and I wanted to ask your opinions of the ability of the system to judge and evaluate administrators. It brings to mind a study by Richard Andrews at the University of Washington over a decade ago, where he found absolutely no correlation between central administration's judging of the effectiveness of administrators and the performance at the site, and there was a correlation between teachers judging the effectiveness of principals and the actual performance on the site.
As long as the evaluation of principals is not based upon achievement level of students, then I have to ask you, what is it based on? And since there's an agreement that we will not evaluate principals, for the most part, on achievement level of students, then it becomes quite subjective. And again, Portland is no different than any other community. And honestly, there are principals that have been in schools where children have been underachieving for 10 years. And some of these principals have gotten awards. So there is no relationship that I can see between the evaluation that administration has of an adult and the performance of the children.
Ronnie and Merced, it is a pleasure to have at this polite podium people who do not mince words. I would invite you again to join us next week on February 14th with Charlie Hinkle to talk about a community which has a civic heart. Thank you. We are adjourned.